So my name is Nikos Askitas. I'm a mathematician by training and persuasion. I thought I was wearing many hats, but I feel right at home here, having met so many people that have done so many different things and migrated from field to field. So, and thank you to the organizers. This is a wonderful venue. I will say a few things. This is joint work with Klaus Zimmermann. I will say a few things about health and well-being in the 2008 crisis through the eyes of Google search. I will not mention the word model more than this one time. So I will paint pictures of health and well-being in the crisis using data. First of all, I'll sketch for you the crisis to remind you what it was like to be around in 2007, 2008. The first signs of the crisis appeared in 2007, and it became acute, and of course in the dramatic fall of 2008. By 2009, I use the word infected because there are more than one reasons that this is the right word here. It infected most of the industrialized world, and by some accounts, we are still in the immediate shadow of that crisis. It has impacted the world as we knew it in many, many ways that policymakers and decision makers, as well as economists, will sort out in the maybe decades to come. Now, in 2007, we had the first failure. Bear Stearns was in trouble. It lost its 90% of its value soon after that and was purchased by JP Morgan. The US labor market, which was doing well for a long period before that, was showing signs that unemployment may inch upwards, and the Dow Jones Economic Sentiment Indicator hovering around 60 to 70 was become bleaker already in 2007. At the same time, more and more mortgage payments were failed to be met. Now, by September of 2008, Lehman Brothers was upon us. At the time, it was the biggest underwriter of mortgages. And Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac were being nationalized. Unemployment were inching up to 6.1% from 4.1%, the low that it had reached by that time. The economic sentiment indicator was lost 60% of its value, was down to 20 points. And we had Bernanke arguing that we need a backstop, reportedly saying if we don't do this now, we may not have an economy on Monday. By all accounts, the TARP backstopped and prevented total meltdown. So that's kind of the time that I want to describe and use Google search to see what we might be able to say about health and well-being. Now, I'm well aware that we may have went from irrational exuberance in the times before to irrational sullenness right after that, so irrational gloom. I compare this to, this is a crisis like no other crisis, much like the Iraq War was like no other war. That was the time we invented embedded journalism. We could see live on TV real battles. And now we could see live on TV the crisis. We could see every day in such a real-time way that it may have exacerbated ill-being and suffering. So, but nonetheless, ill-being and suffering is still real, even though it's due to irrational sullenness. So that's what I think Google search will show to have recorded. Now, I view Google searches as some sort of utterances. They form an ad hoc panel survey. It's not regular. It's, people volunteer their data when they want. It's not driven by the interviewer, but by the interviewee. And it's not like we pose the question and get the answer, but we get the answer and then we try to reverse engineer the question. That's kind of like what we do when we use latent identifier models and all this stuff. So the features of this data is remarkable. We are approaching n equals all, big data. Longitudinal and cross-sectional aspects are unprecedented, and this is bound to continue because if you look at I did this for another project I had. These are the prices of 1 gigabyte of storage. You couldn't get in one piece 1 gigabyte in 90 something in 1980, But if you wanted to buy one, you needed 200 to 300,000 US dollars. Today, in 2010, you needed 10 cents. Today, probably you can make money if you agree to get 1 gigabyte of storage and buy some consulting with it. So chances are we'll be saving just about everything for a while at least. Now, if you have sufficiently massive computing resources and some kind of privileged access to data, you may take a more computational route to identifying, getting information out of your data, like big data style, like Google Flu or Google Correlate would be a way you could be working. But if you don't have this kind of privileged access or big massive resources, then you are left with poor man's big data, which is Google Trends. So in that case, you need a more Sendian approach. You need to kind of have a hypothesis and semantical approach to this. So that's kind of what I will use here. An example to play around to express what it feels like to be doing Google Trends, which is normalized data of aggregate behavior, aggregate normalized data, is like you're outside a football stadium and you hear the aggregate cheer of the crowd. And the question is, can you tell the score in the end, right? So the answer is close your eyes, cheer. Does it have a sigh of disappointment? No, that's not a missed opportunity, that's a goal. Okay, so you can count the total number of goals. Now you have to attribute those to the team. So provided the visiting team is from far away, you can exploit the difference in the crowd, the numbers. And so the loud goal cheers are home team and the others are the visiting team. So you could, if you are lucky, and sometimes you can, also with Google Trends, but now you can start thinking about all the problems. What if nobody scores? What if the other team never scores? You can't calibrate the loud and the, and what if the distribution of loudness of individuals is a strange one? What if the visiting team is more rowdy than the other ones, right? So all these kind of things are entering the picture. Now, so the question is, can I use Google search data in the recent economic and financial crisis to recapture or verify some of the theorems of the economics of well-being? I put theorems in quotation marks because a prominent economist that heard me say that said, we don't have theorems in economics. So I take him at his word and put these in quotation marks. Now, we know we have to have information in the Google search data because we know that Americans used it in the crisis for bargains, jobs, ways to upgrade their skills, investment strategies, housing options, all kinds of things. And we know that 8 in 10 Americans use it to find health information. And we also know that some of those were tending to a loved one who was ill. So if I had to summarize, because the World Cup is starting, another soccer metaphor, if I had to summarize the literature of economics of health and well-being as it relates to the business cycle, I would say it can be summarized like this. If you're a team player, a soccer player, and you are on the first team, then you're satisfied, you're mentally healthy, happy, and you're very self-confident because you play every game. But the chances of you getting hit, injured, are higher, and the chances of neglecting to be vigilant about your health are higher. So you kind of, because you may lose your spot, so you kind of try to make it to the end of the season. If you are benched, right, so you run lower risk of injury, you have time to fix some of the problems you had that you didn't before, but if you stay benched long enough, you might suffer from self-confidence, you might have all kinds of problems, you might not recover your performance of before. And this is kind of like what summarizes the debates in that literature, in my opinion. I'm well aware that in life things are more dramatic than being benched in soccer, but this is still a good summary the day the World Championship starts. Now, capturing ill-being, one way would be to say, let's look at reported malaise or pathogeny. Yeah? So in the US, you would look at CDC reports. But in the crisis, people also tend to lose income, so they may not go and record their malaise. They don't go to the doctor. They try to fix it themselves more often than before. So here is where we can have an advantage if we're looking at search data, because if you want to fix your own problem, then you have to learn how to do it. So you have to search for documents in order to learn how to do this. Now, so we need to proxy two things. You need, if you are ailing, you need a diagnosis of that and some kind of treatment. So probably you are going to go and search for symptoms of depression or symptoms of heart attack or symptoms of high blood pressure. And if you are, and things that you may look for are side effects of Xanax or side effects of Zoloft, Lexapro, Prozac, or Cymbalta. Those are all antidepressants. So searches containing the word symptoms proxy well self-diagnosis. Do I have this? I'm going to the doctor. What is it that I have? Usually people don't go to the doctor anymore in the time of the internet saying, I have these symptoms and what could they be? But they go and say, do I have depression? I read it somewhere in the internet. I have 3 of the 10 symptoms or whatever, right? And searching for side effects is a good proxy for medication. So you kind of capture before and after diagnosis as well as treatment. So these are the 2 large classes of searches: symptoms on the one hand and side effects on the other, and we'll restrict them on the category of health, Google category of health. Okay, so this is my first picture. Then I'll describe it for you. Right up there, you see that's the U.S. in the health category, and that's Germany. Here's September of 2008, and this is the spring of 2009. This is the peak of the graphs in both cases, and the dotted graph, which coincides with the solid line here, is symptoms containing swine flu as well. So you see here is the first epidemic of swine flu, here's the second. You see very well here that this was not a European thing, this was in Latin America, and so it was more relevant in the US. But in the second epidemic we had cases in Europe, so here you see it happening in both cases. So, but now let's throw these away. They couldn't possibly be relevant to the crisis. So the solid line is what you have without swine flu symptoms. So now look at what happens. This is ground zero. This is September 15, Lehman Brothers, right? So you're around 30 here, and you jump all the way to 40, and you never look back. You peak up there, right? And in Germany, there's a large delay because in Europe, this was not our crisis back then, no? We didn't have any effect yet. This was another American financial crisis, right? In Germany, in spring of 2009, we had GDP starting to inch downwards and unemployment rising. And there you have it, the very same thing with a phase shift, right? This is the same thing with side effects. It's not as possible to separate the flu here in the German case. Now, if you notice, these go back all the way to 2011. I didn't update these graphs because those are. I just need the effect of the shock on these searches. But if you wonder what's happening today, this is what's happening all the way to today. I think Google has a problem here. I discussed it with them, but it's inconclusive as to what that might mean. But what you notice is that the general thing is we're not back to where we started before the crisis. We're still high. We're still way too high. I mean, in every kind of shock of this nature, what you have is in a short time we peak and then we sort of dissipate very slowly into the future. But in the German case, it even looks like it's inching upwards, right? It's a very strange thing, and it's one of the open questions in my mind. What has changed with that shock that didn't go back yet? Are we still are people still stressed in some way? Are more people than before the crisis still forced to self-medicate or self-diagnose? Then we do the same exercise in the G8. So we do that totally the Google way. We take, for the language we don't know, we don't speak, we take the 2 keywords and we put them into Google Translate to get Russian, Italian, French, and Japanese. And we take that string that Google Translate gives us, put it back into Google Trends, and do the same exercise. And we get that for the symptoms, so very, very similar pictures. Beware, it's a little bit of cheating because the scales are different, but the qualitative aspects are there. I mean, just pay attention to the scales here. here's a 15, here's a 20, and so on and so forth. But you see, we see the same thing across all the G8. Why did we do this exercise? To kind of establish that this is not spurious or in any kind of way. You know, it could be in the US that a series like Dr. House had a lot of success, and people were, you know, all of a sudden Googling to find out what the disease that was that Dr. House was talking about. But we have it just about everywhere. Now, since these are relative volumes, so you take the volume of the keyword that interests you and divide it by the total volume in the same time unit. If you try to get rid of the denominator, one way is to substitute with another one. So we take annual symptom searches and divide them by football searches. So you get the ratio of symptoms to football. And if you see spikes, then you just know that one goes faster than the other. And if you do this exercise for enough of the other things that describe the human condition, and you always see an increase, now you more and more establish the fact that you really have a genuine increase in those searches. Caveat here is, of course, that we don't know the distribution of power using of, you know, some people may search a lot, some less, and so on and so forth. Now here's a graph which shows you symptom searches with 52-week moving average in the US. That's on top. You see the TARP epicenter right here. And down here you see unemployment. You see that unemployment stopped, bottomed out here and started going upwards again. And right here at the epicenter it was well underway to increase. Here's some more graphs on antidepressants. This is Celexa side effects. These are Lexapro side effects. These are Xanax, and these are Zoloft, and you can see the spikes right here. Right. Finally, these are the Google search, the health categories in the two countries, also consistent with a timeline of the crisis. And this is a breakdown of symptoms in an attempt to find out where they come. You see the dotted line, that's symptoms in general. Then you take out the H1N1 searches, the swine flu, and that's the solid line. And then you take all these other keywords here. So you see swine and flu and cold and kidney and menopause and medical, herpes withdrawal, salmonella, and I guess this is symptoms and side effects or something like that. Allergy, infection, Lyme, diabetes, AIDS, HIV. So all of these keywords kind of account for that much of the total volume. And the rest is, there's no way to specify it. I redid a graph, this I did yesterday. It shows very vividly, those are two searches. One is Lehman Brothers, that's the green line right here. And the other is blood pressure symptoms in the US, right? So you see, nobody wanted to know what Lehman Brothers is about before, and nobody wanted to know after, except September 15. That's September 15 right up there, right? And now look at that. That's symptoms here appears to be about 30, and spikes within the space of a couple of weeks, 100% upwards, right? So those are very dramatic days in the US. People were lining up to get their money out of ATMs, right? So that's what we think we see here. And of course, it never comes back down there. It's very slow in the way it comes down. Now, other theorems of the economics of well-being that you can kind of recover or at least describe in search is you see a spike in searches for recipes of all kinds, which is in line with shrinking disposable income, and we know it from data from restaurants that restaurant visits going down in the crisis. We also know that life quotes and inspirational quotes spike in the crisis in an attempt that people get inspired to keep up. And curiously, and that's also known in economics, obituaries spike in the crisis. For the same reason, probably, because obituaries are like this. He or she was a great person who overcame many difficulties to achieve a lot. So that's what people like to read in the crisis, and searches for obituaries spike as well. Economists call this leisure time. It's kind of a strange way to call it, but if you're unemployed, you may have more chances to look at obituaries. We also have a spike in chocolate cake recipes around that time. I haven't seen how this compares today, but we know also that confectionery spike in economic crisis. Now, my 2 cents instead of conclusions, search describes, to the extent that this type of data, scaled data, aggregate data can describe such a thing, paints a good picture consistent with what we know so far, and in some ways very vividly and very surprisingly describes the well-being and malaise, ill-being in the crisis. But it would be useful, mighty useful, to have microdata, search microdata. For example, one question that would be interesting to see in search microdata is to find the probability that you will search for side effects if you searched for symptoms sometime before, right? So then you would have really panel surveys. And the other thing is, of course, why do symptoms and side effects remain so high such a long time after the crisis? Some answers could be e-medicine is there, self-diagnosis persists, money shortage is still there, we don't know. One could construct a system to just monitor symptoms and side effects on a global scale, right? So you can plot it on, you can make some kind of heat map of the planet to see where interest for these are higher, and if you believe they proxy diagnosis, self-diagnosis and medication and treatment, then you would have some kind of interesting heat map. We haven't done this, but it's an interesting exercise. And lastly, what W. Brian Arthur calls second economy, that's the routers and web servers and everything that underlines the digital world that underpins the entire world economy. That used to be the log files of that world, used to be stuff sysadmins read in the morning when they came to work. That's our new business reporting language. And we should show an interest as to how these log files, which were designed to troubleshoot, can be also reconstructed so that they serve social science. And I think that's my last slide. Thank you.
I think there may have been a little bit of similarity between this talk and the last part of the previous talk, which is looking at online data, which has its own specific characteristics. There'd be a range of reasons why people search on Google, and then kind of assuming that it must be because of some kind of personal thing that's happening in their lives, not, for example, because they saw news coverage of something and then were curious about side effects. I think a lot of Google searching is about curiosity rather than desperate personal need or because you're on a certain medication. So have you accounted for this gap at all, or are you just assuming that they're one and the same?
Yeah, I mean, positive reinforcement is something you observe everywhere, right? As soon as you have things repeating every day in life, most of the things repeat every day. You have to worry whether your Y influences your X, so there's no way to disentangle that. It happens everywhere. So yes, you're right. There are impulses that make you go there, but even that may show that you don't have a linear situation. But if you get more impulses to go and search for something from the media, that in itself is related to an increased awareness about symptoms, right? So you're right. It's not. It breaks linearity. So if I wanted to quantify it, that's why I didn't attempt to precisely say how much malaise there is in the world. But if you want to get the qualitative aspect of that, every one of these, even irrational gloom feelings, so to speak, even things that are not real, count in the equation.
But it's not necessarily gloom if I'm just curious what side effect.
Right. You may be hypochondriac for all I know, right? So.
Or curious.
Yeah, or curious. Yeah, you're right. But to assume that in the crisis the curiosity goes up, it's kind of far-fetched assumption, I think.
When looking at the drug queries, did you counter for the different names of certain drugs across countries? For example, Prozac is called, I think, La Dose in France, quite humorously.
Yeah. Doing this thing, I learned so much about so many things, and then I had to find all the drugs, and I learned that there are two types of antidepressants, for example, and so on and so forth. So I did it only in the US. This is for the US, these graphs. And I looked at the commercial names. I mean, they all basically, there are families of them, and they use the same ingredient, but I looked at the brand names, because that's what people are searching for.
So here, so you might be interested in looking at the work of the group of Eric Horowitz at Microsoft Redmond. I don't know if you've seen it. They are using Bing traces, and they are following also single individuals over time, and they are also looking for causal effects in also side effects. So it's quite, there are no people from Microsoft now, but so at Microsoft they are doing this with the Bing traces. I can give you the point.
Thank you.
Really interesting paper. Do you think there would be applications? I was giving a presentation to some civil servants yesterday, and we were talking about how you might use data. I mean, surely the passport agency could use a similar methodology perhaps to, I mean, because they are in crisis, because there's a rise in the number of passports, it would have presumably been possible to use this sort of data relating, I don't know, to holiday searches to predict that, do you think?
Yeah, sure. There is literature on this. I think there is, people are looking at travel and stuff like this to forecast tourism, for example, in Spain. I think there's a couple of papers there. But I mean, in this case, of course, it was relatively easy. Once we had the keywords in our heads and we realized the proxy diagnosis and medication and treatment, it was trivial. Of course, we kind of had to think about it, but we were lucky that these are so. You may look for symptoms of the crisis itself, so that's why we restrict in the health category. So it was, once we thought the keywords, the situation was clear. For other topics, it may be more cumbersome. Then you have to go and do some kind of harvest the wisdom of the crowd to categorize them and group them like we heard yesterday. But in this case, it was more clear cut. But yes, in principle, that's a good idea to at least experiment with.
So let's thank the speaker again.